You wrote a tweet in May of 2022 about your ghost story. Let's start there. What is your ghost?
So my ghost is the diagnosis of bipolar disorder that I received when I was 20 and was in denial of for 16 years. And so I got a chance to unpack that story at the intersection of being an entrepreneur and having a mood disorder, one that's characterized as a severe mental illness, which really I faced a reckoning in 2016 when I was hospitalized for a second time with the diagnosis that I received in 2000 when I was a senior in college, and went through living hell for the next year, and somehow got through it. And I shouldn't say somehow because I know how. Medication, a great doctor, an unbelievably loving now wife and supportive family. And so as I processed what had happened, I started to feel like I wanted to expunge the shame that I'd felt for so long from having a mental illness, something that affects so many families, maybe all families, have a story somewhere. So that was the ghost. And I decided it was time to bring it out of the shadows and say, hey, here's what I've dealt with. Here's how I've tried to overcome it. And, give folks at least one additional story out there to be aware of as we all go through the tough stuff in life.
How did you know that you had it? Was it something that happened? Was it a pattern that people were starting to notice? Like, what was the tipping point where you finally, they kind of said you had it and then you acknowledged that you had it?
There were two moments. There was the moment I was diagnosed. And for many of you who aren't familiar, bipolar disorder is a disorder of mood. It doesn't mean that you're only high or only low. It just means that you're capable of greater extremes on the high side and the low side. So for bipolar 1 on the low side, the depression that you experience can become so severe that the suicide attempt rate for bipolar 1 is 60% at some point in one's life. And the suicide rate from the best available data is 19%. So one of the reasons why one rejects this illness, which is so frequently diagnosed between 18 and 25, is, what person at the peak of their powers in feeling invincible, which are, people in their early 20s, wants to learn that statistically there's a 1 in 5 chance that they might end their own life. And then on the high side, which is psychosis, mania, messianic delusions, elevated speech, grandiosity, irritability, distractibility, rapid cycling of moods. Basically, people who have lost their mind. Who wants to know that could happen again? And what you're told is this could come back at any point. It might be 2 weeks or it might be 20 years. And in my case, it was 16 years. And so I felt like I had a bomb in my brain that could go off in terms of mania. And then I was aware that I could get so depressed that I might end my own life. So what I did with that information was I chose to reject the diagnosis. I refused therapy. I refused treatment. I went off my medication, an all too common story. And I just buried this deep down. So much so that most of the time I wasn't even aware that this had happened. It would be like once every couple months, I would have this rising panic and I would remember this thing and then I would push it back down. And so it wasn't until during kind of the heyday of building a startup, of building this e-commerce business, Bonobos, was the first time that I started to sink into depression. And I would have periods of time where I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't go to work. I didn't want to live. And that's a hard place to be as any human being. And certainly if you're supposed to, lead a team and inspire others. So that was when I started to be like, well, wait a second, this whole manic depressive diagnosis, maybe that was a thing. And then in 2016, it just came back with a vengeance. And I had a second psychotic episode, spent the week at the psychiatric emergency room and then the psychiatric ward at Bellevue Hospital in New York City with psychosis, with mania, with messianic delusion. And coming out of that, now it was like okay, no doubt about it. This is what I have. I've been in denial of it for 16 years. And it's time to just wake up and deal with this. And I was also 36 years old. I had 400 employees. I had changed a lot. I'd grown up. The world had evolved. And most importantly, everyone rallied around me and was clear-eyed about it. I moved into a hotel with my mom and she found me a psychiatrist. My now wife, who I couldn't see for a week due to an episode of violence that happened during the mania, stood by me even as I went through the legal system on that. My management team at Bonobos rallied around me. The board said, we back you. This isn't uncommon. And in fact, the data shows that bipolar disorder affects somewhere around 4% of the general population, and that it probably indexes 7-1 in entrepreneurs, according to a study from the University of California, San Francisco. So that's 1 in 5 entrepreneurs who might be dealing with a mood disorder, to say nothing of other forms of neurodiversity that over-index in entrepreneurs: anxiety, panic, unipolar depression, addiction, the autism spectrum. So in a way, we already know entrepreneurs deal with these issues. Let's talk about it. Let's bring it into the light so that we can take care of ourselves and each other.
Real quick before we, and my next point was going to lead to entrepreneurs and where some of these characteristics tend to show up more. But when you're going through this, is it a pure chemical imbalance, or is there something that was triggering you, or was it just a certain level of stress finally puts you into a state of mind that you can't control?
Yes. My psychiatrist, Dr. Z, has a way of saying that everything is overdetermined, that we as human beings, we seek these singular narratives that help us understand the past so that we can make sense of the present. And the truth is, there's probably multiple vectors that are informing something as complicated as bipolar disorder. For me, there was definitely something new that happened 3 weeks before I had my episode, which is I used psilocybin mushrooms for the first time in my life. It was the same year that I was using MDMA, ecstasy, for the first time in my life. I was a senior in college who was drinking a lot and smoking a lot of pot as well. And from what my doctor says, any of those things can interact with mental illness in a way that we may not understand exactly how, but it can be a part of the sauce, the mole that is coming together, that perhaps takes, and here's where I'm just venturing afield, as a citizen, not as a physician or a scientist, but that potentially can interact with the underlying mood disorder and bring it to the surface. And then there were 2 things happening in my personal life. I'd fallen in love for the first time, which it creates its own kind of euphoria, even without mania. And I also had this like gothic conflict with my dad going on. I had been charged with a misdemeanor possession of a fake ID, which isn't the end of the world, but my dad took it really hard. And it was the first time in my life that my dad was so disappointed in me. And I felt that, and it was just crushing. And I also felt angry at him that he was taking such a puritanical view of something that I felt like was like, de rigueur for a college junior, college senior. So when we look at it, in love for the first time, the euphoria from that, the euphoria from, the sexual relationship that has got its own set of endorphins going, the drug use, conflict with dad, senior in college, a lot of, marijuana and alcohol. That was all in the stew. I guess I've now used stew, sauce, and mole as analogies that may have contributed to this eruption of psychosis, the manic episode that resulted in the diagnosis of bipolar 1.
It's interesting you say some of those things. I've been in those shoes, not to experience the bipolar, but done a lot of the things that you've done at certain times in my life when you were doing them. And the more I've talked to entrepreneurs, which, I have a business as well, and I hear you, and I've talked to hundreds of founders. And what you find is a lot of this is a common thread amongst people that start businesses or take big swings and take big risks. So let's unpack that a little bit. What about somebody that is bipolar also makes them, in a lot of respects, an amazing entrepreneur, or the ability to lead and set vision and build teams, when you might hear of bipolar and say that nobody could ever do that, it's bipolar. And it turns out, like you just said, 7 and 1 or 1 and 7, however you said it, are doing that.
Chris, is what you were telling me that you're on mushrooms right now when you said at times in your life? Just kidding. So you said something, though, that I want to benevolently correct, which is you said, that being bipolar, and I want to make the distinction that no one is bipolar. We only have it.
Okay.
And it's a funny thing we do in society. By the way, this is not you, this is everyone. This is me for so long. I still have to correct myself. We say Andy is bipolar. The analogy is Andy is cancer.
Yeah.
The analogy is Andy is diabetes. Luckily, I don't have cancer or diabetes, but the point is that we would never equate a physical medical ailment with someone's very identity. With mental illness, we say someone is bipolar. So we're basically making your illness your identity. And just think about how messed up that is.
Yep.
Because bipolar disorder is scary enough without being it. Like it's scary enough having it. And it's part of why it's so stigmatized, is that it takes on this gothic quality that this person is this unstable thing, when the truth is that it's an eminently treatable illness. With medication and therapy, I would argue you might be able to access more stability than someone who doesn't have bipolar disorder, because there's phenomenal medications and because therapy is wonderful and I think should be required, for everyone at some point in their life. So back to your question, there's a state in bipolar disorder called hypomania, and it is the antecedent to mania. It precedes it. So if mania is you're on fire, you're a 10 out of 10, you're God or you're a superhero, you're off the rails, you're ranting and raving about whatever, you're going to save humanity, you're going to bring peace on earth. Hypomania is like 7 or 8 out of 10. Let's call it 8. And the characteristics are the flight of ideas, a sense that everything happens for a reason, not necessarily a messianic delusion, but a grandiosity, a sense of self-importance, maybe an exaggerated narcissism, maybe a little bit more irritability or distractibility, decreased need for sleep, an increase in high-risk activities that are pleasure-seeking, financial risk-taking, sexual risk-taking, flawed judgment. These are more or less the central casting traits of an entrepreneur having a good day. Right?
I was going to say everything.
This is what we expect our entrepreneurs to show up with. And it leads to, delusion that goes too far. All you have to do is turn on the news and look at people whose delusions were not checked by reality. And some of these folks end up in jail. Some of these folks end up being claimed by suicide. I've gotten a chance to invest in an entrepreneur, a wonderful bright light who ended up, ending his own life. This is all too common. It's all too common as human beings, that there are so many forms of neurodiversity that we don't talk about. And almost every single form, from what I've learned from the University of California at San Francisco, and what any of us who know creative types, artists, founders, entrepreneurs, it's intuitive that we know and expect a certain level of quote unquote crazy. And Steve Jobs, when he came back to Apple, ran a campaign. What was it called? Here's to the crazy ones. And so we even celebrate it and lionize it. And so what we need to figure out is how to acknowledge it and to understand that there are these formidable strengths, these superpowers, but they all come with shadows. They all come with kryptonite.
Yep. And the shadows being, like you said, how low you can go. The highs are the highs, but it's the downside of this is the lows. Is that correct?
Well, I think it's for bipolar disorder, there's three problems. There is mania if you have bipolar 1, where you can lose your mind, which is pretty dangerous. Anything can happen. In my case, an episode of violence where I harmed 2 people that I love. I think without great lawyers, without being, white or half white, without understanding people around me who experienced the violence, I could be in a federal penitentiary right now. I was charged with felony assault of a senior citizen. Maybe if I was in a different geography in the country, we wouldn't be doing this podcast because I would be yet another incarcerated person who has mental illness and who doesn't have the privilege of being able to mount their own defense, right? So mania is scary. It's horrifying. Terrible things can happen. Then you have depression, which we talked about. Either losing your life to depression, or I would argue equally bad, not wanting to be alive, but being alive. And then hypomania, which we talked about, which has a lot of productive attributes, but which can produce its own errors of judgment, sexual indiscretion, financial ruin, taking something, let's say you're a startup entrepreneur that's rising and figuring out, how to crash it. Mm-hmm. And we see those stories, right? The high flying Icarus-like entrepreneurs who it looks great and then, it crashes. And, all I have to do is turn on the news or Netflix to see those stories. So there's a lot of costliness